Toronto. My name is Raseshwar Madhava, and today we're going to be rerunning the previous Facebook Live event that we had just over a week ago on going against a rising tide of contemporary culture. The reason why we're redoing it is last week when we had done it originally, we had noted that there were some technical issues with the camera and it was very difficult for viewers to watch the content, hopefully improve things for all the viewers moving forward. And so we will get started by starting off with invocation and then going into the topic. Om Gyan Timirandasya Gyananjana Shlakaya Chaksun Ulmitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svaya Rupa Kadamayam Datanti Sva Padantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yura Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunath Anvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadhutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padahan Sahagana Lalitam Shri Vishakanvitam Sha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchna Gaurangi Vrade Vrindaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Turubhyascha Kripa Sundaiva Cha Patita Nam Bhavnebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So thank you again for joining us. And so today, again, as I mentioned, the topic again is going to be talking about going against the rising tide of contemporary culture. Now, the reason why we say going against is because generally in today's society, following any type of principles is not exactly the easiest thing. I think most people will acknowledge that for the most part, people are trying to do what they want to do and whatever feels good, right? And we know that from the ancient Vedic texts, so the talk today will center around Vedic texts, specifically from Bhakti Yoga. And essentially what we're trying to do is bring ancient wisdom for modern times. And generally we know from the Vedic texts is that following certain principles actually has a tremendous benefit in our life. And so we're going to be talking about specifically four principles that have a tremendous value in today's society, even though a lot of people may think aren't as relevant. We will try to show you why these would be tremendously beneficial to even consider taking up and the different benefits associated with it. So when we talk about, so just introduce myself a little bit first before we get going, in case this is any Raseshwar Madhava. And I've been practicing the Bhakti Yoga for the last 15 years. And I was really fortunate that I got introduced to Bhakti Yoga when I was very young by my parents, and started reading Bhagavad Gita when I was 9, and very curious from a very young age. And fortunately, I became more serious about my practice when I was traveling for my studying out in London. This was about 15 years ago. And I've learned a lot about myself also through my practice of Shaolin Kung Fu. I've been doing that for the last 30 years, and I feel that's really informed my practice of Bhakti Yoga because there's a lot of principles that I adopted very young that we can apply to our day-to-day spiritual journey. Moving on from there, I've had a chance, fortunately, to live around the world just through my studies. I had a chance when in 2007 to 2009, I was living in an ashram or in a monastery with monks. I was going to school, but I was living in that setting, and that provided a tremendous opportunity to learn, to train and understand myself as well as these teachings. And then fortunately in 2015, after I completed all of my studies, I was able to go to India for a few months and live there with monks and spend some more time studying. In 2015, I was also really fortunate to take initiation from my spiritual master, and this was in the Brahma Madhya Gaudiya Vaishnav lineage specifically. And since then, we've been trying to apply these principles that we'll be talking about to the best we can, and also try to share them with others, because we know from thousands of years of great sages and saints that have come before us that they've laid this path forward for us to benefit from, and we'll hopefully share some of that wisdom today for all of us. By training in day-to-day when I'm as a pediatrician, and so schooling for me took a little bit of time, and it was a really great opportunity not only to practice this tremendous process, which I could practically see have so many benefits to my life, but also when we're trying to integrate anything new in our life, it takes some trial and error and experimenting, and I really felt like my years of studying really gave me that opportunity to really solidify the practice and go through different ups and downs during this practice. When I'm not working, I really enjoy reading Vedic texts. Again, not only to help better understand myself, but to understand the world around us and how it functions. I really enjoy spending time with my family, and when I'm in places that are warmer in the world, I love to be underwater scuba diving. So just again, introducing this concept, these 4 principles that we're going to be talking about today. Again, they're principles. The reason why I call them principles is because they are meant for all times, and they really do provide us an opportunity for our own personal development and growth. And although the time, the place, and the circumstance might be different, principles are ones that are everlasting if we choose to adjust them based on the given circumstances. So the 4 principles that I'm going to start off by talking about, consider these to be the 4 principles of Dharma. And now the word Dharma can be understood as one's inherent nature or the inherent property. So for example, if the inherent property or the Dharma of sugar is to be sweet, the inherent property or Dharma of water is to flow, the inherent property or Dharma of an acorn is to become an oak tree. So we also as human beings have a Dharma, but it's not actually based on the body that we see or we interact with day to day. It's actually based on the level of the soul. And so we will talk about that further today, because that's actually where the real source of our happiness that is coming from, and something we're all looking for in our day-to-day life. But sometimes we're just looking for it in different places. So again, going back to these 4 principles, the 4 principles that we're going to talk about today, I'd like you to keep an open mind and see these as but consider these to be 4 principles or pillars of freedom. And so the first is being truthful, so that refers to having honesty in our lives. The second principle we're going to talk about is purity, so that involves living a life that is clean, both internally and externally. The third principle we'll be discussing is the principle of non-violence. So many people may understand that to be ahimsa, and that can take very many different forms. And the last principle we're going to be talking about is the principle of discipline. So discipline means the ability to really push through difficult challenges to achieve the desired goal. So those are generally the 4 principles we're going to talk about. Now, when we normally talk about these principles, especially in the practice of Bhakti Yoga, we generally talk about them in 4 big main practices. Now, I like to think of these 4 practices as very gross levels of practice, but again, major things for a starting point. And then we can actually break down these 4 principles more subtle. But the principle that really allows us to imbibe the principle of, for example, nonviolence is being mindful of our diet. So, for example, adopting a vegetarian diet where we're showing compassion for all living beings. The second main practice that we can consider is the aspect of purity. So purity refers to that cleanliness, the aspect of cleanliness. And cleanliness usually in the understanding of Dharma refers specifically to physical relationships. Now, physical relationships usually mean having monogamous relationships, or specifically having sexual relations specifically in monogamy or within the sanction of marriage. Again, that's at a very gross level. The third principle or practice is specifically a truthfulness. So one of the main practices that underpins being truthful is avoiding, for example, gambling, which is considered to be a form of cheating. And the fourth major gross practice that is going to be with referring to discipline or austerity refers to refraining from intoxicating substances such as alcohol, but then even more refined such as caffeine. So we have these 4 principles. Now what I'm going to try to do initially is I'm going to tie them to a specific a model. And this model that I'm going to be talking about to tie these principles in is a way for us to understand how they apply to our body. Now, the yoga system understands that there's 5 koshas, or 5 specific layers of a being, right? And so essentially they start from outside, more gross, to internally, more subtle. And so what I'm going to do is work through these 5 layers, explain briefly what these layers mean, and then we're going to go into just how following these principles actually apply to these layers. So before moving on, we're just going to check and see if there's any specific questions that have arisen so far. Okay, so there's no questions. What we'll do is we'll start off. That first layer that I wanted to talk about is called the Anamoy Kosha. So Anamoy specifically refers to Anamoy refers to food, or the physical aspect of the body. Now we can obviously see that what we actually put in our bodies actually has an impact on the output. So as we mentioned, one of the principles that we can follow, specifically that principle of nonviolence, having a vegan or vegetarian diet really does have tremendous effects on the physical body. As a practicing doctor, I'm looking into this more and more every day, and there's more and more research coming out every day on the physical benefits to our body of adopting a plant-based diet. Some of the things that people may want to consider, there's tons of research out showing that a plant-based or a vegan diet helps us reduce the risk of obesity, it helps us reduce the risk of diabetes, it helps us reduce the risk of heart disease and cholesterol. And so these are just some of the very basic things that it can help us. And most of the healthcare costs these days are all around these 4 or 5 conditions that I just mentioned. So immediately, if we want to not only to improve our physical health, adopting this specific diet can have a tremendous impact. And I'm seeing all over the place now making this recommendation to patients, seeing people coming back and talking about the impacts that it has on their body, their physical well-being, how they feel. Not only that, we'll also go into that's the Anamoy Kosha, and that's specifically how one of the principles immediately can have an impact there. So we're really looking immediately to improve our physical health, and we understand that having a positive impact on our physical health first, then immediately has an impact on our mind. So we're really trying to get at working at having better awareness and control of the mind, starting with our physical bodies, the Anamoy, the diet, what we're specifically putting in, really has a huge difference. The principle of discipline, intoxication, also of alcohol, also has a tremendous negative effect on our body. We know that it impacts the liver. It also impacts not only the mind, but it has tremendous impact on other organs in our body, but also the physical aspect of our body, like, for example, promoting weight gain. And so again, we're looking at the whole theme here is really looking at what we're putting in our body, because ultimately to have optimal mind, decision-making capacity, and to be able to accomplish what we want to do, really being aware of what we're putting in our body will make a tremendous difference. The second kosha that I wanted to review is now the second kosha, which is a little bit more subtle, is the pranamoy kosha. So prana refers to as the life air, or specifically the physical force that runs through our body. Now, it refers to the energy in our body, and prana, it actually is specifically what connects the mind and the body. So a basic way to understand that is that what our mind experiences, the physical body manifests. So for example, when we're actually feeling sad, the mind feels sad. The way the physical body may express that is, for example, tears. And so it's actually the prana then in our body that actually connects those two aspects of our body. And we also very much know that there's a famous saying by Hippocrates, "You are what you eat." And so the reason why this is actually so important is because what we actually put in our bodies actually also impacts the mind, right? We know that there's so many specific, like for example in meat, there's so many chemicals and hormones and different things being injected into factory farming these days. Also the consciousness of the animal when they're being killed, all of these things we take on in our body when we actually consume these things, and that actually also ultimately has a impact on our mind. And so again, talking about the prana, the life air, we know that also the life air, the energy in our body, it's understood in the Ayurvedic science, which is the functional medical science from the Vedas of ancient India, that when we actually consume products like meat, it actually blocks the flow of prana or energy in our body. It's understood that our body constitutes of 7 main chakras. Chakras are considered specifically energy centers, and through those energy centers you have nadis or energy channels, and where they cross, that's actually a chakra. So it's understood that these eating foods such as meat, alcohol, other intoxicating drugs, other things, that they actually block the flow of energy through these nadis and ultimately through the chakras. And it's understood that by blocking these chakras, this is actually the source of illness and disease in our body. So it's actually the blocking the flow of prana, the flow of energy and air, that actually leads to disease of the body. So the more we're actually in tune with keeping these channels open, clear, and transparent, the more optimal the prana will flow, and we'll have a better mind-body connection. The third aspect, the third layer that we're going to be speaking about is specifically manamoy. So mana refers to the mind, and it specifically refers to the thoughts that are derived from the mind. Now we understand that the foods we eat, not only the foods we eat, they have an impact on our mind. So for example, foods that are high in sugar, salt, fat, caffeine, these are all actually agents that increase the inflammation in our bodies, not only our bodies but our mind. And so the reason why this is important is because ultimately our mind is what governs our thoughts, and that's actually impacting our focus, our concentration. Medical science now has identified a whole field called nutritional psychiatry now. And essentially this area of nutrition at how food impacts different medical conditions such as anxiety and depression. And we know, for example, sugar, too much sugar actually worsens our symptoms of depression, and minimizing sugar actually has been shown to have a positive impact in our mood and in the symptoms that people experience with depression. There's also another important hormone or neurotransmitter in our body called serotonin. Now, serotonin specifically is the hormone that specifically regulates, not only helps us with our sleep, it also helps us with our appetite. It helps mediate and mitigate our mood, but it also inhibits pain. Now, 95% of this neurotransmitter is actually produced in the gut. So not only is the gut an important place that's going to absorb the food, it's also going to be responsible for producing this neurotransmitter that has so many regulatory functions on our mind. So we should, again, be conscious of what we're putting in our body. And not only that, if we want to look at the impacts of the other principles we were talking on the mind, if you ever want to see the impact of cheating in general, but just gambling, just take a look at any major Hollywood movie, and any movie you see where there's a casino or a gambling scene, every time there's a major bet that's put on the table and there's a lot of money at stake, they always zoom in on the face of the person. Why? Because there's a huge amount of anxiety and stress. So we see how this type of way of being actually has such a tremendous impact on our mind, and is very easily seen in simple examples such as that. Another area or principle that has tremendous impact on the mind is specifically, for example, physical relations or sexual relationship. The very easy way to understand this is when we look, for example, at competitive athletes or sports. Now, if you go to the Olympics, or if you talk to any, or specifically any fighters, boxers, martial artists, anytime there's a big fight or a big performance, you will. It's well understood that there is actually no sexual activity at all prior to any big performance. Why? Because actually these practices, is well understood that it has a tremendous effect on the mind, and actually reduces focus, concentration, the ability to be sharp. So again, this is well-established practice. So if we're actually looking for ways, we don't have to look so far. There's so many practical examples in our world that show us why the people who are highly successful are actually doing these things for certain purposes. And now the next kosha that we're going to actually talk about is Vijnanamoy. So Vijnanamoy specifically refers to the layer of intelligence. So it's more subtle than the mind. And the layer of intelligence really is that layer of discrimination. It's the layer that actually refers to the reasoning aspect of our minds. It's the intelligence refers to the reflective portion of our mind. See, the mind can be pulled in both ways. It can be pulled by our senses, which is very common for many of us, or it can be pulled by the intelligence. Now, it's that intelligence actually serves as the witness and understands ultimately how we're experiencing the world, but it also has the ability to release limiting beliefs. And so by following these principles of Dharma, all of them actually cater to refining our intelligence. Again, we talked about the food that we put in our body. We talked about having pure and righteous relationships, not exploitive, non-violent behavior, having discipline. Again, these are all specific practices that will refine our intelligence. And more specifically, the Bhakti Yoga text, if we really want to hone in and refine this intelligence, we spend time with people who are sharing wisdom. We spend time with saints and monks and people who really have practiced this Bhakti Yoga science for many, many years to help us actually refine our intelligence, because they actually have lived a life where they can impart knowledge. And so when we receive it, actually it has a tremendous effect on our intelligence. And when we're in those positions that we're feeling distressed and we're not knowing what to do, the more and more we refine our intelligence, the more we've heard from wise people, the more we've immersed ourselves specifically in Vedic texts, in scriptural texts, this actually fortifies the mind. It really strengthens by strengthening the intelligence, we fortify the mind. It's like putting on armor for the mind by strengthening the intelligence. And by doing that, we can actually we can be more contemplative, we can be more reflective, we can choose that rather than react. And so really the Vijnanamoy Kosha really is extremely connected to these principles of Dharma that we're talking about. And finally, the last layer, which is again the most subtle layer, refers to Anandamoy Kosha. So this is really the kosha it's the most subtle layer, and it's that kosha that is related to our inner peace and the happiness. And why is that? It's because the happiness that we experience it day to day, it's something that comes and goes. Why? Because it's based on satisfying our senses. This Anandamoy Kosha, it's most subtle because it's actually happiness at the level of the soul. Now, the happiness at the level of soul is something that is persistent and it is eternal. It's always there. So the aspects of the soul, we have to understand there's three characteristics or properties that make up the soul. It's Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Sat means that it's eternal, it's always present. Chit means it's fixed in truth and knowledge, it's all-knowing. And Ananda, it's always, again, striving for, looking for happiness, right? And we ultimately know that while we may be practicing these principles, these codes of principles of Dharma for a variety of reasons to benefit ourselves in so many ways, ultimately, actually this level of Ananda, this fulfillment and long-lasting happiness of the soul actually only comes when we please God. And specifically in the Bhakti Yoga text, we refer to God as Krishna. So the way we actually practice this Bhakti Yoga practice, there's 9 main specific processes. And the two that really are the most emphasized is hearing. So we refer to hearing as hearing from those wise saints, hearing from scriptural texts, and chanting. Specifically, we refer to chanting mantras. So mantra means, man means a mantra, means to free, so to free the mind. So mantras that actually help free the mind, but these mantras specifically act at a much deeper level. They act at the level of the soul. So we have this very famous called the Maha Mantra, the great mantra, referring to the Hare Krishna mantra, which we chant on a daily basis, not only specifically through japa, which is an extremely powerful practice for those that want to take it up, because it really is, it's understood that it's actually doing that cleansing from the inside. So Bhakti Yoga really is approaching happiness from an inside-out approach. Whereas generally in today's world, we're striving for happiness. We're looking for a very superficial version of happiness. But eventually, when people start to peel the layers off, they understand that actually there must be more than just what's on the outside. And most people are working outside in, but in the practice of Bhakti Yoga, we're starting at Anandamoy. But it's also really important that all these other koshas, refining all these other koshas, actually helps facilitate that last layer, that Anandamoy, that seeking that bliss. So again, those are really the four principles that we wanted to talk about, and specifically the 5 koshas that we wanted to tie them to. Now, we had a few questions from the previous session, so I'm going to go ahead and address those. And so the first question was, regarding ahimsa, what would be the best way to deal with provoking situations and be disciplined? So this is a great question, and to appreciate actually that what this question is addressing is not an easy thing. Ahimsa refers to that aspect of non-violence, and it's understood in the Vedic text that actually one's greatness is measured by how they respond to provoking situations. And the reason why this is so is because actually to deal with provoking situations is not an easy thing. And that's why there's so much emphasis put on this, because so easily the mind can be agitated and we react. So at a very basic, very kind of at a first glance, the way I would answer this question is the most important thing is, although it may sound simplistic, take a deep breath and step back. So immediately just by doing those two things, there may be someone or something that is self-provoking as best as possible if we can actually, because we want to try to move from a place of reacting to responding. So again, we're trying to move from we want to be able to reflect first before, and one of the best ways if a provoking situation is coming upon us, usually from perhaps another individual, is why don't we let's take the opportunity to understand first before we want to be understood. So the best way is to ask questions. Ask questions, even if we're totally provoked and we're having a very difficult time settling down our mind. Just stepping back, taking a deep breath, and trying to understand will immediately help change our response. Taking the approach of using communication that is not strong and harsh, non-violent communication, that's also a way that we can approach provoking situations. I think it's also really important that we realize, actually, all of us, it's described in the Bhakti Yoga text that actually all of us, we actually have, as living entities, we all have 4 defects, right? And if we understand that all of us have these 4 defects, then when we look at other people and they're provoking us, we should also understand that there's some element of what we see in others in us. Because these 4 defects that that I wanted to elaborate on is that we all have imperfect senses. We all actually have the ability to fall under illusion, so we can be tricked or be misled. We all have a tendency to make mistakes, to err as human. And the 4th quality of all living entities is the propensity to cheat. Now, more easily you can understand that, the propensity that we all sometimes have to take that shortcut, to take the shortcut, to find the easy way out. And so, again, I feel that reflecting on these 4 principles, even though, again, it might be hard in the moment, understanding, trying to adopt that role of acknowledging that there's some capacity, some element of those in us, and understanding that these in others, so we can actually help us, again, use that intelligence to be able to discipline ourselves in the response. Now, as I mentioned, these practices that I even mentioned, being very straightforward, is actually a practice. Discipline means practice. So it's not something that's going to come right away. And think of discipline as it's the compromise between what you want now versus what you want the most, right? That's a really good way of thinking about discipline. Tapas, where the word discipline or austerity means heat. So that heat that we feel when we want something so badly right now, but we actually have to, we should always meditate on what we really want the most. And we were always focusing on the best outcome that will always actually allow us to step back and do the right thing. Because ultimately, it's not about who is right, but what is right. So these are some just practical ways to approach provoking situations. And I think, just to finish on this question, having the mood of and the mindset of being appreciative, having some gratitude, for myself, that's been extremely powerful in trying to set a good example, wanting to be a good example. This practice of being thankful, having some gratitude is extremely powerful and really will underpin this principle, because it's understood actually without being compassionate, we can't actually adopt this principle of ahimsa or nonviolence. So nonviolence is the doorway into love, and really to enter into that loving situation with ourselves, with others. It starts with compassion, and it starts with gratitude. The second question that is come forward: how does the concept of karma tie in with these principles? That's a great question. So think of these, karma essentially refers to work or activity. Now, karma can be seen as a law, so it's a law of action and reaction. So what one will sow, that's actually what you reap. And it's the law of cause and effect. Now, understand that following these 4 principles, there's actually, it won't necessarily, following these 4 principles, the law of karma, cause and effect, you will still sometimes have to go through your karma and certain things that are coming to you. But first of all, these 4 principles give you the best mindset and the best lens by which to deal with the karma that comes to us. So that's first. The second of all is this principle of karma is that there's actually 4 stages of karma, right? The first is like the seed, so actually having the desire, right? Now, as living beings, we all have desires. That's actually something we cannot get rid of. We cannot get our desires. So the best thing is actually we can only change our desires, and we should always be striving for the right desires. Now, I can definitely say, based on all of my life experience and everything that I've read, these 4 principles of Dharma actually allow us to have the right desires. Because sometimes we don't actually know what we should actually desire, right? And then so from that desire, you actually get a decision that's based on what we feel, on our mind, and based on that decision you act. And from that action you actually get a reaction or an effect. So I think it's important to understand those 4 stages, but I want you to understand that these 4 principles really, they're here to empower us, to actually allow us to make the best choices for ourselves, to really act from the platform of wisdom. And in today's world, actually, this is the greatest commodity that we can not only give ourselves, but give others, is wise choices, is wisdom. Everybody's looking for it, right? And these 4 principles really are the foundation of, it's really the foundation for having this wisdom to be able to make wise choices. So that's a little bit on that specific question. The next question is applying the principle of daya, or compassion, outside of not eating meat. That's a great question. So daya refers to the principle of compassion, as we said, or of specifically non-violence. And while eating meat not eating meat is a way to show respect and compassion for all living beings, there's actually other ways that we can do this in our day-to-day life. I think the first place that we should really always look to is actually, first of all, being compassionate with ourselves. Sometimes it's actually people have such difficulty doing good for others, seeing good in others, because actually they're not actually compassionate on themselves. They're not actually taking care of themselves. They're not actually trying to see themselves in a positive light. So the first thing for that compassion, the compassion first has to start at home with ourselves, right? Before we're doing any, trying to do others. And again, this is a really important principle if we're trying to have an impact, a positive impact for the rest of the world. I think the second area where being compassionate really, really comes out is trying to be very conscious of not criticizing and being judgmental of others. This form of judgment that we have sometimes on others is so, first of all, it's actually very harmful to ourselves, because we first doing tremendous amount of harm to ourselves by trying to boost ourselves up and at the expense of pushing other people down. That's actually generally why people criticize, is because they choose not to see any fault in them, right? But this way of judgment is actually and even though that may sound like a strong statement, it is actually something that's very true. So really trying to look at not being critical and judgmental. It's understood that, in this time we're in, it's called the age of Kali, the time of quarrel and hypocrisy. In previous times and ages, they were so pure that they actually received karma. They received karma for even if they had negative thoughts for other people. Now, because there's been such a degradation of spiritual principles and values, that at least we have the concession in this age that we're in of Kali, that we only actually receive karma if we actually willingly express or commit harm to others, right? So even if it's in our mind, while that still has an impact, we won't actually accumulate karma from just having thoughts in our mind. It's only on the action, on the actual speech, that we actually incur karma. So really, being mindful of this critical nature that we have is really important, and it's something that we definitely, all of us, are striving to work on. And this is where really trying to imbibe these principles, specifically compassion, can have an effect. The other aspect that I was thinking about of Daya or compassion actually comes in our environment. Work that has the least impact on the environment. Many people today in the environmental world are talking about reducing our carbon footprint. So looking at simple things like public transportation, walking, looking at clothes and products that are reducing the carbon footprint in the world. For example, vegetarianism is actually very much a diet that is looked at for reducing our carbon footprint and overall the environment. So, passion and diet. To help and others and bring out the best in others. So that's addressing that question. And okay, so those are all the questions that we had today. Just going back on a really practical level, I will definitely speak from my own life experiences just for a couple minutes. Following these principles, they're not easy at first because most of society today, generally, they will be seen as alien and even sometimes not practical or very restrictive. I can definitely tell you from my own life, I wasn't born a vegetarian. It's something I only adopted after trying to take my practice of bhakti more seriously 15 years ago, so I was eating meat. And I can definitely tell you, the moment I can remember the last day that I ate meat back in 2004 or 5, and the biggest impact that I noticed on my body was actually on my mind. My level of my temper, my anger went down immediately. I saved a lot of my brain cells. I saved a ton of time. I always saw my friends the next day. They were extremely hungover after going out. They lost tons of time, energy, and so I really, and just from a practical point of view, you're going to save a lot of money. So I just really felt, those are really the only, 2 principles that were ones that I didn't follow. I wasn't a big gambler. It wasn't something that I grew up with. But again, when we, and then the last principle, the principle of purity or illicit relationships. I think one of the important things to understand is that, again, there's gross understanding of this. So we understand is only sexual relationships within the confines of a monogamous relationship such as marriage. But I think that's at a very gross level, but a subtle level that's much more prominent in today's society is, for example, the area of pornography. And that is something that's really, really impacting people in all stages of life. And we won't get into, getting into that. There's a good friend of the Bhakti Center in New York. He's really taking a lot of time to address this topic specifically for men, because it's a topic that's having a tremendous amount of negative impact in today's society. And so, again, just wanted to list it out there and just share some of my own experiences. If we were things that I did, I remember when I was meat eating, and I remember one of the things, some of the principles that really had me be more successful. First of all, the company we choose to surround ourselves is vital when we're trying to adopt any new habit or principle. I just heard just earlier today, I forget who was saying it, but they said that success is tied to 2 things, and it says it's tied to what you're reading and who you're spending time with. And if you really examine these 2 things in your life, really we can create a blueprint for success just by focusing on these 2 things. So I can definitely say practically in my life, being around those that obviously weren't eating meat, that helped tremendously. Learning more about it, reading more about vegetarian, that helped. But really, it was a company that made the difference. I think another important principle that really helped me, again, start small and try to be consistent. I think a lot of times when we're trying to integrate new things in our life, we'll try many different things. So obviously we're talking about these 4 principles of purity. Maybe there's one that you feel really impacts your day-to-day life, and maybe you want to start with that one right now, and then maybe move to the other ones. So I think starting with one thing at a time, I think, is a good way to approach it so you don't feel overwhelmed. If you feel like things are rolling, then maybe you can pick up other things. But please understand that these 4 principles that we talked about, they're actually all integrated. You may be doing one, but not the other 3, or maybe doing 2 or 3, but not all of them. But really to experience the full benefits and to really follow Dharma in its best way, these principles are actually all integrated. For us to have the most impact and the best benefit, it's actually only going to happen when these 4 principles are working in conjunction with each other. One of the things that I used to do for myself when I was trying to build a new habit or trying to remove a previous habit, I would actually mark on a calendar the day that, for example, I may have slipped or given in or not done what I wanted to do. I'd mark it on the calendar, and then I would actually take the opportunity to mark it again when it happened the next time. Now what that basically would let me do is it would practically allow me to see the time that would go by, and eventually you could see 3 days became to a week, became to 2 weeks, became to a month, and so on. So it's a great visual aid to be able to celebrate and monitor your progress, because I think a lot of times it's not easy for us to see our day-to-day progress. So having a calendar and marking it off when the last time we were engaged in something that we didn't want to do, and then trying to monitor the progress that way. That was really helpful for me. The last, one of the other things that will also really, I think it's helpful for anyone, but if you're struggling with something, find a mentor, find a coach, find someone that you feel is already doing this that might be able to impart some wisdom and advice to be able to help you. I can't speak to the tremendous amount of benefit of having mentors and coaches in my life for everything that I'm trying to do, even practicing bhakti, trying to integrate the principles. We all trip and fall, that's not a problem. I always tell people, if they have a bad habit they aren't proud about or they want to change, I always tell everyone, it's not about where you are, it's where you're going that counts. So trying to bring people in our lives who might be further along is definitely one principle that has been tremendously beneficial for myself. And I think the other thing, the last thing that I'll just leave on is, if we're trying to think about these 4 principles that really have such a tremendously powerful effect in our life, is if there's one that we may not be convinced about, or we're having a hard time gravitating toward or following it, think about envision yourself what the person you will be and the person you want to become if you were to follow these principles. So essentially what the exercise is trying to focus on the positive things that you feel will manifest in your life by actually following these principles. And again, instead of focusing on the challenge or the difficulty, by focusing on the positive, we're always keeping our mindset strong in a positive area to keep pushing ourselves forward, and meditating on those benefits certainly will help us rise to the challenge when the going gets tough. So those are all the experiences that I wanted to share today. And if there are any questions, again, we mentioned at the end of the webinar last week when we had done this originally, that we will be starting a Facebook group called the 4 Pillars of Freedom. Now this is really an opportunity for everyone and anyone who is really interested in trying to adopt these principles, to create a community around these principles. If you're following them and you want to refine them, there's an environment for us to talk more about that. If you're struggling with something, we would love to hear from you and hopefully encourage you and try to provide some tips on how things can be improved. Again, this Facebook group is going to be visible to all. However, it's going to be a private group, so all you need to do is just request an invitation to join. And really, we really want to build a community around these 4 principles that are genuinely helping us to free ourselves and live the most successful and empowered life that we can in our spiritual journeys. So again, you can go on Facebook online to find this group. If there's any questions, please again leave them in the comments below, or through Aditya in Calgary and Edmonton. He has contact information and can pass that on. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna.